my mother and dad met when Dad was in LSU, and they married in 39, and then I was born in 40. And so he was already out of college and in the military when I was born. So I am an Army brat forever. Our first assignment was in Fort Polk, and we lived in a little place in Louisiana called Magnolia Park. And during that time, we happened to be, it was the time for Pearl Harbor. And my mother remembers going to the base to try to talk to Daddy after that, and they wouldn't let anyone in or out. And then from there we went to our Hot Springs, Arkansas, and we were there for a little while. And from Hot Springs we went to Camp Fannin near Tyler, and Mother and I lived in Tyler for a little while. In 1943, Daddy was deployed to France and Germany to aid in the war effort. And he stayed there for 10 months. And then when he came home, we were living with my grandmother and granddaddy in Baton Rouge. And he came home to there. And from then we went to the San Antonio area to, I don't know, somewhere in San Antonio area. Some of those places I didn't know exactly. Can't remember what the names were. I wasn't old enough. I was 4, something like that. And then from then, after that, in 1946, Daddy was deployed again to Europe, to Italy, to take in the peacekeeping after the war, to war the people that were there to take care of everything that happened and that couldn't happen. And then in 1904, that's when he had Mussolini's horses. That's when he did Mussolini's horses. He was assigned to take care of the horses that Mussolini had left and they weren't being taken care of, and the commanding officer wanted to know if there was any farm boys in the bunch, and my dad was from Kentucky, so he definitely was a horseman. And so he was assigned, he and his men were assigned to do that, to take care of the horses. And he rode pretty often when he was there. And then in 1947, in January, or very early spring or January, we got a chance to go to Europe to be with Daddy. And we found out later that we were the first boatload of dependents to go to Europe after World War II. And we went on a troop ship from New York City through the Strait of Gibraltar, around the bottom of the boot of Italy, all the way up that side, and to a place called Lido, where we debarked. And there was no place for us. They'd forgotten or something that we were coming. They were part of a shipload of dependents, and you could only take one child at the time. So there were mostly women with single children. And they put us up in Lido, they put us up in the Hotel Excelsior. And now it's a fabulous resort area. And at the time, that was where we were living. And we lived there about 6 weeks or so. And they thought maybe our billeting was ready in Trieste, but it wasn't. So they took us to Venice. And there we lived in the Doge's Palace, which it was all silver, all gold and marble, and it was just fabulous. And I've been back since then, and I can remember running up and down those marble stairs. All of us kids did, and we lived in a suite of rooms there, and the maids would bring us food, our dinner and lunch and all that. And then from there, they did finally get our billeting ready in what we call Rocky Heights, which is on the top of the big cliff overlooking the harbor in Trieste. And so the name of the little town was Opicina. The Americans had nicknamed that section where we lived in Rocky Heights. and we lived in little stucco buildings. And the funniest part of that story is the Corps of Engineers had given the Italian laborers the plans. And needless to say, they went awry somehow. We had no insulation and no plumbing. So they had to work that out before we could live there. So we spent a little more time in Venice. And then we got to go in our little houses. And they were little tiny houses, and they had wood burning fireplace and stove to cook on. It was all wood burning. No gas. No electricity hardly. We were without electricity more than we were with it. And it was right close to Yugoslavia. And the Yugoslavs were still mad about the whole situation, that they didn't get that deep water port. So we had to kind of be on alert most of the time when we lived there. And they would come over and throw hand grenades at vehicles. And we had to go to school in downtown Trieste, down the hill from Opicina. And we went in Army vehicles and with guards, armed guards. And we went to a school in somebody overtook I think the Germans or the Italians had run the nuns out, and we used their convent for our school. And we had just a few teachers. Some of the mothers had been teachers, and they were part of the teaching staff at the time. And sometimes we would have to go down the hill in armored vehicles with armed guards because the Yugoslavs had slipped across the border and were cutting up again. And they had armed guards from all 4 countries that were living there, that were keeping the peace there, which was England, France, Russia, and America. They were all had bases. They're sort of like Berlin and Vienna, by the way. And so they marched guard around that convent 24/7. And Mother had been assigned a machine gun and taught to pull the trigger, and all the women had been taught, and that machine gun stayed on our dining room table. Needless to say, we did not eat dinner there. While we were in Trieste, it was a divided city, and the people had very little, the officers and all had very little to do. I mean, they just, marched in formation and, bid rifle practice and things like that, but there was not really a lot that they needed to be doing. So they would party. The officers would get together, and one group, like the French, would have that next party, and they would have the can-can girls come in and the French champagne. And then the next group might be the British, and they would get the Scottish kilt and all those guys that danced with that, and Scotch. And then the Russians would have vodka and the Cossack dancers. And then the U.S., the GIs, would always be asked to bring Coca-Cola and bring the jitterbug, people that could jitterbug. They were fascinated with our jitterbug. And bourbon, Kentucky bourbon. Mother said they were great fun. And she had told me one time that at one point Mother was tall and very, very attractive and elegant, and she had beautiful clothes. She made them, but she really did a bang-up job. And she and Daddy did ballroom dancing. And when she and Daddy get on the floor, everybody would just sit down and say, "Well, Fred and Ginger are here." And she said they were a lot of fun, the parties were. And one time a Russian general or some dignitary drank champagne from her slipper. While we were in Italy, my dad didn't learn any language. Well, everywhere he went, he just didn't. He just learned. He just knew English. But I learned street Italian, and I was pretty good at it because he would take me shopping, and we would get what we needed because I knew what to ask for and how to ask for it. And the Italians thought I was great because I would speak their language. And he would. Then one time, the streets are so narrow over there, and cobbled, most of them at the time, and he ordered a brand new, now this was 1947, 48, but he ordered a brand new 1945 black four-door Buick. That's the newest he could get. The war effort had slowed, production down at home, and so he had it sent over there on a ship, and when we got it, we had to drive it back up, and he had a terrible time. He had to go around several little tiny towns because it wouldn't go through the streets. It was a broad baby. So while we were in Italy, we did some traveling, and for one thing, we all went to Pisa, and to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And at the time, you could go up in it, and we walked all the way up. It's a very strange feeling to be slammed on one side, walk around, slammed on the other side. It's a feeling you'd never forget once you'd done it. And I have pictures of me and my mother and my dad on top of with the bell on top of the tower. And then we went to Venice again, and I don't remember too much of that, but we had some pictures of that. And after that trip to Venice, we went to the Alps, the Italian Alps, and did some sledding and ice skating and that sort of thing. In Cortina is the name of that little town. And it had been taken over by the British and Americans, and so it was a great, nice resort for the troops to go on vacation to. The last year we were there, they moved us to town in a villa, a really nice villa, and we had our servants there. We had a family that came, and the mother did housekeeping and cooking, and the daughter was a babysitter, and she also helped around the house. And the father was the gardener, and he kept the car so clean. One time, mother was throwing away coffee grounds, and the lady of the Italian family said, "Oh, no, please don't throw that away. Please let me have it. Please let me have it." And Daddy came in and he said, "What do you want?" And she said, "Oh, please don't throw the coffee grounds away. I must have it. Oh, please don't throw it away." And he said, "No, you may not have my trash." And she said, she just burst into tears, and she said, "But we don't have any. We don't have any coffee. And I can make it over, because..." And so he said, "Mama, you buy this lady a pound of coffee." And do you know she wouldn't take it home? She left it there, and she took a spoonful out every day to take home with her, because she said they would kill me if they knew that I had that much coffee, for the coffee. When we moved back to the States, Daddy was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, and we were there a couple of years, and I went to school on the base and we lived in housing on the perimeter of the base, and it was nice, and there were lots and lots and lots of families and kids to play with at all times. And I got my first bicycle there. And I remember that because it was, a new thing. I never had one before. And I never had another one. That was it. And then from there, Dad was assigned to Fort Knox in Kentucky, right outside of Louisville. So we lived in Louisville, and I started school in the 5th grade there. And we bought a house across the river in Clarksville, Indiana, and it was a little fixer-upper, and my mother and Daddy did fix it up, and that we stayed there. And then we moved back to Fort Benning for a little while because there was something came up and he had to go back, and we lived there for a while, and then we moved back to Indiana at a different school, Jeffersonville. By the time I got through with 5th grade, I had been to school in 3 states and 5 schools in the 5th grade. I don't know, to tell you the truth, how I learned anything that year. In 1951, Daddy was assigned to go to Germany for our Army of Occupation, and so we stayed there in Indiana until Mother had her second baby, my brother. And then as soon as he was 4.5 months old, we got on another ship with my other grandmother, my dad's mother, and we went across the ocean again. This time it was a much shorter trip and much more pleasant. And we went to Bremerhaven, Germany, and got off the ship there and caught a train and went all the way down to Frankfurt. And Daddy met us there, and he was actually at a place called Butzbach, which is where his assignment was. And so we lived in Butzbach in a beautiful house. It had gardens, just extensive, and lots of fruit trees and vegetable plots and all that. And we just thoroughly enjoyed that. We cultivated it, all of us, because it was there, and it was a shame to let it go. Mother made the best preserves out of the cherry tree at that time. And it was pretty cold there, and it snowed a lot. And the hill behind our house was used by the whole community for sledding going down. And so naturally I did, and Mother and Daddy came one afternoon, I guess, when he was off, and they got on my little tiny, tiny sled. And it wasn't 3 feet long, and they got on there and zipped down the hill. It turned over and broke Mother's leg. And so we had a woman that lived with us, a German woman, and it was certainly nice because she helped when the baby was still just 18 months old. And Mother with a broken leg, and everything in that house was 3-story, and everything was up, 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 down, 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 down. And she couldn't hardly do that with a broken leg. And my grandmother helped too. The woman that was our housekeeper in Germany was named Emma Barth, and she had a son, and she lived with her parents in the little town of Butzbach, and she had no husband, and her daughter and her husband had been killed during the war. And she lived there with her parents to help take care of them and her son. And he was my age, the boy was. And Daddy would pick him up in the morning and bring her to the house, and he would take her home in the afternoons. And it was a great help to my mother. In Butzbach, I went to school in 2 rooms in the upper story of a big building. And we had 2 teachers. So we had 1 through 5 was in one room, and grades 6 through 12 were in the other room. And I was very, very short at that age, and I was in the 2nd class, and I looked like I should have been in the 1st one. And people always got me mixed up with the wrong group of kids. But we learned pretty good there. And then from there we moved to, that was Butzbach, and from there we moved to Bad Nauheim. We went to that little school, and it was the first school that was called DODDS, but actually the first one had been the one in Italy, but they didn't call it that at the time, but that's what it was designated in the archives and all. So I was, another one of those firsts of going to a DODDS school. And then we would go on trips, and we went to see a beautiful lake in Switzerland. I don't remember the name of it, but I have pictures of me standing on the edge of it. Then we moved from there to Stuttgart, and we had a big school there. It was a big place, big town, and a large, large facility for the military. And so they had lots and lots of kids there. And we had high school, and we had basketball games, and we had cheerleaders, and everything that you'd have if you were in the States. And it was a DODDS school, but it had everything. While we were in Stuttgart, it was a huge facility, and Dwight Eisenhower was on his way to becoming the president, and he was saying goodbye to the troops. And when he did, he went to all the troop facilities to thank them for their service and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure he was thinking, vote for me, but he did. And so we had a big reception at our house, because Daddy by then was, maybe he was a lieutenant colonel already, and he was a ranking officer, and the guy ahead of him's wife wasn't with him, so they didn't want to do that at their house. So we did it at my house, and his whole retinue, all the people that follow after the general came, and I got to serve drinks to some of those guys. And then it was General McAuliffe was there, and he's the one that said nuts to the Germans during the war at the Battle of the Bulge. And he said it wasn't intended to be to the German. There was something else going on in his office, and the German man walked in, and he threw this paper down. He said, nuts! And the guy thought it was for him, and he went back and told his German officer, that man's crazy. He just said nuts. What does that mean in English? So he became famous for denying the German surrender. But he loved telling it. But I met him and several other of the general's staff when I was a teenager. So when Eisenhower would come around before he retired, when he would come around to the different bases, he would send one of his aides out ahead of time to tell my daddy, get your golf clubs out, because we're playing golf. My daddy really played golf, and he was good at it. He was on one of the golf teams, and so Eisenhower would always want him to make a golf game with him when he was there. So he played golf with Eisenhower many times. And actually, the general asked my daddy to be an aide, and my daddy turned him down because he said, I've been away from my family way too many times for this man's army, and I'll just stay with it, with my family. So he did. There's no telling, we probably would have been in Washington maybe, with the general. In 1954, we moved back to the States. Dad was assigned to Houston area, and as a commandant for the Houston area ROTC units all across the Houston area, the high schools, and he would go and inspect the troops. And he sometimes on weekends when they were having football games, he would go to 3 football games a weekend. And I went with him a lot because what else was mother wouldn't go with the baby, so I went with Daddy. And he would review the flag ceremony and all at each ball game. And sometimes they would already have the flag up when we got there at the halftime, but they would always take it down and put it back up so they could show how they could do that. And it was interesting to go with him. When Dad was assigned to Korea, he went. I was in high school, and while he was gone, I graduated from high school and started college, and then I met my husband, and we got married in 1959. And Daddy went to. He had 2 more assignments before he retired, and he retired in '63. I skipped school when we lived in Stuttgart one time. All day. That's besides being stupid, as a child. I mean, here you are in a foreign country with no ID, and your father's in the military. I mean, that would be perfect to snatch you up and ask ransom and all sorts of stuff. Boy, Daddy was mad at me. Whew. And he wasn't very mad at me very often. He and I had a thing. You know, I was his girl, and he was my daddy. That was, I never had that closeness with my mother, ever. She was something else.
What, I don't want to get off this subject, but that seems like that, did the difference between your relationship with your mother and your father, did that come up in other ways while you were in Europe?
Oh, yeah. Especially when I was older. Well, when I was a little child, it was okay. It was all the same, you know. But Mother evidently became jealous of me. That's the only thing we could ever figure out, and Dad and I. And she never gave me his mailing address. She would not let me write to him. And I asked my grandmother for it one time when I was getting ready to go to college. And I wanted to go to Sam Houston in Huntsville. And my mother wanted me to go to University of Houston so I could stay there and do what she wanted me to do. And so I didn't want to do that. So I got the note. I got my grandmother to send me his address. And I wrote him and I asked him, could I please do that? I had a roommate. I had my stuff all sent from Bel Air to the school to register and everything. He sent me a letter pretty quick back. Yes, by all means, go where you want to go if it's not out of state. So, and Mother, God, she was mad. She didn't want to take me up there. She finally, you know, I think her first cousin lived there, and I think her first cousin convinced her to take me up there. But she told me when I left that house that I was not welcome back. And she said, you better damn well take everything you want, because you'll never see any of it again.
And how old were you then?
Just turned 18.
So I must have been feeling pretty terrible.
I was glad to get out. She wouldn't let me go. She wouldn't let me go to church. She didn't see. I think something clicked somewhere with Mother. I mean, she was a very good mother to me when I was a little girl. I mean, she made all my clothes. She had birthday parties for me. I mean, just, and all of, you know, when I got to be a teenager, I had a lot of boyfriends, and I think she just, I don't know. I don't know what it was. And she got worse when Daddy retired. She didn't want to come to troop. She didn't want to see my children. She just, I laugh and say, and it's a terrible thing to think of your mother. I mean, I took care of her when she was ill. When she died, you know, she was with me. I was sitting right on the bed with her, holding her hand. She was still my mother. You know what I mean? And, but she, I don't know what happened to her. I just don't know. It was very strange. But she thought my children were, they were just bumpkins, hicks. They didn't know anything. They would never make anything. But my brother got married and he married a woman that Mother did not like. She actually liked David pretty well. Not real well, but tolerated him. But she didn't like Sue. And Sue was a teacher. And she said, nobody I know has any sense that's a teacher. Thank you, Mother. And then my youngest child has been a teacher 33 years. My mother wouldn't even talk to her about it.